Thank you, lady. Okay, the call is now being recorded. All right, so hi, my name's Spencer. I'm going to talk to you a bit today about sport kite design. I'd prefix it with that I don't quite consider myself to be an expert in sport kite design, especially dual line sport kite design, but I've been getting into it a lot lately, and I'm learning. So a bit of background on me. So I'm Spencer. I've been flying kites for about 16 years now. I fly quadline kites outdoors. I fly them indoors. Sometimes I fly them as stacks. Sometimes I fly the stacks indoors. Sometimes I fly them as a team, or I also fly dual line, and I fly those indoors sometimes too. So I fly lots of sport kites, and about 3 years ago, I decided to start building them myself. Oh, hold on, I'm getting some issue. Weird. Okay. Yeah. So I started building the kites a few years ago, mainly because I had an issue where I broke a kite and I wasn't super happy with all of the different products, Quadline products on the market at the time. So I decided to just start making my own, and so I started in with Quadline kites. So we'll talk a bit about Quadline kites first, because that's where I've built the most so far. I've built about 60 Quadline kites over the last 3 years. So I spent a lot of time there, and then we'll also get into some dual line kites for the second portion. So on quadline kites, there's a few kind of topics. The way I'm going to kind of go through things is mostly looking at some of the different things that I've just thought about over the last few years, different experiments that I've tried that have been either successful or unsuccessful, and just kind of general ideas that I've thought about. So first part is the center V in the quadline kite. This is, a very common feature in the quadline kite. Unfortunately, it's a weak point, right? This is the point in the trailing edge where the two trailing edges come together. And this is often sewn by taking, it's like one sheet and you slit up the center and then do a folded hem on either side of the slit. The unfortunate thing is that slit can spread. A common solution to this is to reinforce it, often with like Kevlar or something. But as you can see in this photo, that's not always totally successful. And this photo here is actually the tear that led me into kite making. I had this kite, it broke in this way. And so obviously when I started thinking about kite making more, I'm like, I don't want this to happen again. So I started thinking a lot about how to solve this problem so I don't run into it again. The first idea that I thought of was going with strategic seams like this. So the idea here is that this eliminates the slit in the seam. So instead of having one panel that you slit and then fold back either side, instead I have a seam where I have the corner. So I have a stitching that comes right up along the seam. So there's not actually any slit to split, right? It's just two seams on top of each other. They're folded independently. So you don't really have that weak point anymore so much. You can still throw some extra reinforcement in there if you wanted, but I haven't done that a whole lot. I've started doing a bit of reinforcement on the outdoor ones just for safety, I guess, but I've never had an issue so far. Another idea that I've seen largely from Mike Mossman has done this, a whole rounded trailing edge. If you're familiar with Mike Mossman's kites, you'll see, like the whole trailing edge is just rounded. And that's something that I have a to-do there because I'm gonna try to experiment a bit more with that later. In that I like the idea of doing the rounded trailing edge, but I don't like the whole thing rounded because the trailing edge is really important. The trailing edge is what is basically, if you're off on the edge of the window, the only thing left to catch the wind is the trailing edge, right? So if it's a fully rounded trailing edge, you're kind of cutting off some of that. And I want to keep as much of my trailing edge as possible. So I think I might try a little bit later to do kind of a smaller rounded corner, just like a small rounded corner on the inside as much. I got to figure out how tight of a corner I can do and still do a folded hem through it without any slits. I'm not sure how tight I can make that. So that'll be a future experiment. But yeah, so those are some ideas on the center V. The next idea was thinking around vertical rod tensioning. So what I'm talking about here is on quadline kites, right? You typically have these vertical rods that go from the leading edge and then down to the bottom points. And traditionally, these are tensioned using end caps on either end and bungees to hold them all together, right? The problem that I've always had with that is that the bungees have these big knots, and that's really easy for lines to get snagged on the big knots, and that's super annoying. So one of the first approaches that I saw to kind of address this was to just tie the top end cap on with bridle line instead. The idea being that, oh, we already have bungee on the bottom, so you only need the bungee on one side to make it easy to take the rod out. And so we can get rid of the bungee on the top, get rid of those big knots, make it a little like less likely to snag on the line. And that's nice. The one downside to this is that I could potentially think of is that now you don't have any cushioning against the leading edge, right? If you landed really hard, you have all this pressure going up against the leading edge and there's nothing to buffer that. So maybe that force would be hard on the rod. So far, I haven't really seen any issue with that. And when I think about it, it's like kind of hard to land really aggressively with a quadline kite in the first place, right? If you back up really fast, it ends up flipping. So it's actually hard to get a substantial amount of force in that direction anyway. So that's been a nice kind of first step concept for simplifying. The next obvious step from there is getting into T-fittings. There we go. Right, we're here. We take the same concept of, oh, okay, we don't really need the bungee up here, but instead of doing a lashing, why don't we just make a fitting for it? So this is a 3D printed fitting that I use on my indoor kites. And so it cleans up everything really nicely. It has a hole through the middle that you can throw the bridle through, and it's just super clean. So there's nowhere for it to snag or anything. So that's really nice. There's a few ways to get these. I 3D print my own and designed my own. And then there's also a few manufacturers are doing this so far as well. I see Ocean Shores Kites. They have their own T-fittings that they use on their kites. The Gin from Kite Forge uses T-fittings as well. And I think 3Wind is using something similar to some extent. Amy, I see you raised your hand. What's up?
Quick question on the T-fittings. So when you're storing your kites, are you taking your leading edge out or are you just leaving it in?
I just leave it in. Yeah, the way that I have this set up, so there's a few ways you could do this, right? So far, I've had the T-fittings are kind of firm enough on the spar. Catherine, yes, there is still bungee on the bottom at the moment. But so the T-fitting is kind of loose on the spar. So when I take the leading edge apart, I can slide the rod through the T-fitting pretty easily, is kind of the idea. So it doesn't really get in the way when I'm setting up and taking down, but then the T-fitting maintains its space because of how the sail is around it. So I just have a cutout on the leading edge that's just big enough for the T-fitting. So there's not really anywhere for it to slide. I've considered doing it kind of like a dual line, right? Where you have like an APA fitting and then you have the like super glued on super glued C clips and stuff. And then you've got to have this extra space for it to slide up and down to the leading edge. But that seems like a whole pain. And I haven't really had an issue with it like this so far. I haven't really had sail wear issues from it, which I would be concerned about maybe. But yeah, so far so good. Does that answer your question, Amy?
Yeah, so the only thing I would say is that when you're changing a leading edge, you got to make sure you don't lose those, right? Because they'll drop right out.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, if you're pulling the whole leading edge out, yeah, they'll drop.
Unless the bridle is already attached. Well, I guess it would.
Yeah, I mean, even here, so the bridle, I punch a little hole in the front side of the Dacron that the bridle pulls through. So that will hold it to some extent. right? If you have some knots tied in the bridle and all that, then it'll still kind of stay there, it'll like dangle around and maybe get a little confusing at some point. But yeah.
Yeah, great, thank you.
Cool. Yeah, so that's sort of the next step to kind of clean up things. The final step that I've taken that I've played with is going a step farther, where I get rid of bungees altogether. I've tried this on outdoor kites and on indoor kites. I've stopped doing it on outdoor kites after these have gotten torn out, but let me explain what this is. So this is the bottom tip of my indoor quadline kite, the Breeze. So what's happening is that we have, can you guys see my mouse cursor when I move it around? You able to see that? Yes, okay, looks like yes. It's very small, but you can see it. So there's a loop of bridle line sewn into the sail right in here. If I were to do it more recently, I'd probably do it with gross grain ribbon or something. And then I have a length of bridle line that comes down and loops through that in tensions, just like we would at the bottom tip of a dual line kite a lot of times. You have this little loop, and then you have a knock end cap that you can pop that bridle line into and tighten it and tension it that way. And then this fitting is a special fitting that I've 3D printed in two materials, so that I have the knock here, the bridle connection down here, and then a more flexible material on the tip to keep traction on hardwood floors. I play with this a little bit, but I haven't flown indoors in ages, so I don't know how good it is yet. But anyway, yeah, this approach is nice in that it keeps the sail very consistent. You don't have any shuffling of the sail because of the release and the bungees and stuff like that, but it has no give under pressure. So I have had these tear out of the sail on outdoor kites. So I've stopped doing this on outdoor kites. On outdoors, I'm still using bungees with knots, and then I put a bit of Dacron over the top of the knots to keep them from getting snagged. But on indoor kites, I don't really have pressure issues. So I still do this on the indoor ones because it's quite clean. Yeah, so that's kind of how I'm thinking about vertical rod tensioning at the moment. Any questions about that kind of stuff before we move on to the next bit? Amy, your hand is still raised. Did you still have questions, or are you good?
No, I just don't know how to put it back down. No, I'm kidding.
Okay, I'll put it back down for you. You're fine. No worries. Okay, cool. So next bit, venting. Venting is interesting. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of concepts in venting, not so much the construction approach, but we can talk about that later if people are interested in that. But there's a few approaches to venting that I've thought about. One is that I really like is this concept of distributed venting. So this kite here is vented. It ends up being kind of a somewhat light mid-vent. So all of these little curvy triangle bits, those are all mesh. And I really like this approach of having a design and filling in the design with bits of mesh. And it flies really nicely because I think it distributes sort of the pressure release across the sail, and it makes the sail feel like it flies very smoothly. I feel like you get this feeling a lot with the Elliott Shook mesh kites, and those are very distributed, right? So I really like that feeling. I've done a couple distributed mesh sails so far, and they're absolutely some of my favorites because I just love how the mesh integrates with the design, and it feels really nice when flying. So that's super cool. I also experimented with getting some really heavy vented kites and ran into an issue of having too much venting, namely with this kite. So this was kind of a bit of a learning experience for me, where I flew this kite in some pretty heavy wind, and it felt really smooth, but when I would fly it straight up towards the sky, I could only get about maybe 60% of the way up. Like it just wouldn't go any further. And what I think the reason is that basically this entire trailing edge, there's not much there. Most of the trailing edge is mesh. And when you get off, like I mentioned earlier, when you get off towards the edge of the window, either at the top or at the sides, the only thing the wind can get at is that trailing edge. So if that whole thing is vented, then there's really no way for the kite to gain any lift to be able to push any further towards the edges of the window. So with my newer designs with quadline kites, or for vented ones, I try to make sure that I maintain at least some good chunks of sail down on the trailing edge, because this was just way too much, and it really hampered its ability to move. It just made its wind window really small, which was unfortunate. Yeah, I also, maybe one quick note is that I always try to reinforce the mesh with some Dacron strips as well, because the mesh is, especially on the diagonal, is very stretchy. This is just fiberglass mesh that you would use on a screen door. It's very stretchy, so I try to reinforce it with Dacron so it doesn't distort the shape of the sail so much. But yeah, so too much venting can be a bad thing. But yeah, so that's that bit. Let's see, what do I have next here? Okay, so the breeze. We can talk about the breeze a bit next. So this is my indoor kite that I designed. And so I'll talk about kind of the things that I went through to come to where I have it now. The first bit was obviously the size. So by the time I started making kites, I'd been flying kites for 13 years. I've been flying indoors for a long time, flying the Rev indoors, specifically the Rev indoor. And I've also flown a Rev 2 indoor and a Rev 1.5 indoor. Like I've flown all the things. So when I thought about the different kites, none of them were really ideal for me. The Rev indoor was so big and squishy, but it pressurized really easily and just was so low effort to fly indoors. The Rev 2 was nice and agile, and I really liked the size to an extent, but it was a lot of work to fly indoors. So what I wanted was somewhere kind of in between. So my first step was to basically take the shape of the Rev indoor, and I just scaled it down to be somewhere in between the size of a Rev indoor and a Rev 2. And so that got me to my first iteration of the breeze. And I right away, I liked that size a lot better. And then I played around with the framing, because that'd be a whole thing, because now the sail's smaller, right? So the sort of frame that you might use in the Rev indoor would be too stiff, because it's a full 1/4 inch diameter rod. So it's going to be a little stiffer. It's not going to bend as much to pressurize as much. So to explain that a little bit, with quadline kites, you get pressure largely out of the belly of the sail. And so when the leading edge flexes, then that belly can kind of billow out a little bit. It can cup the air a bit more and have a bit more pressure. So if your leading edge is real stiff, then that belly can never billow out. You don't really gain pressure as much, and it ends up being a lot more work to fly the kite. So I ended up experimenting with, used P90s at first, but those were still too stiff and they were breaking like crazy. I think I broke probably 5 or 6 P90s. And so then I switched to SkyShark 2P rods, and those have been great. I haven't broken any of them, I don't think. And they provide a nice amount of flex for the smaller sail. So been very happy with those. So after I got settled with the framing, I thought a little bit about the aspect ratio of the sail. And by what I mean by aspect ratio is kind of the, in some extent, the height versus the width of the sail, or even maybe the horizontal positioning of the bottom wingtips. So what I was thinking about in this context was, okay, when I fly a Rev 2 indoors, I can do nice, smooth traveling bicycles around in a 360. But with this kite, with the breeze and with the Rev indoor, I couldn't get there. And so I was thinking about, okay, what's the difference between the breeze and the Rev 2? And so the main thing that I saw was that the Rev 1.5 and the Rev 2 and those have the rods much farther out towards the wingtips as compared to the Rev indoor. So what I did is on the breeze, just kind of pushed that a little bit in that direction, push those vertical rods outward a little bit. And that made the kite lose a little bit of sail pressure, but it gained a lot of agility as a result. And I was pretty happy with that trade-off. Another benefit that came with it is that with the original sort of Rev indoor shape, the top end caps for the vertical rods sit right at the ferrule. They're literally 1/3 of the way in, so they sit right at where the rods separate. So when I use T-fittings, then every time I take apart the sail, the T-fitting falls out because the T-fitting is sitting right there at the joint. So by pushing those rods out, then it kind of fixed that issue also kind of gave that extra agility that I was looking for. So that was really, really nice. And that's essentially where I've landed on the design at the moment. And then I've thought a lot about the panel layout as well. And those that know me might have noticed that I use the same panel layout on my outdoor quadline kites that I call the essentials. And so the whole concept around the panel layout with having this sort of colored trailing edge and such was all about, it was all mostly from an engineering perspective. It's all about the bias of the fabric. So what I did was I thought about, okay, you know that ripstop fabric has these squares, right? The squares make it very strong when you're going parallel, when the stress is going parallel to those squares. But when the stress is going diagonal to those squares, the fabric tends to stretch a lot more and will distort more over time. So I thought about, okay, what are the directions of stress in a quadline kite? And so the main points that I thought about are, okay, you have this vertical stress right along the vertical spars, and you have maybe some stress sort of along the trailing edges as well. So I cut up the sail so that I can have that appropriate bias in all these specific positions. So the panel layout that I ended up with is this. This is just, hey, this puts the bias where I want it, and so this is what it looks like, and it ends up looking all right to me. And yeah, so I was pretty happy with that design, because it can be hard to think about, okay, how do I do this panel layout? What makes sense? So having a methodology to stick to of like, okay, I'm optimizing this panel layout for fabric bias, then that made that decision making a lot easier. Yeah, any questions about the breeze before moving on to the next bit?
So Waddy, your I'll call it the grain structure of your ripstop, you know, the vertical and horizontal lines, are they parallel and perpendicular to your leading edge so that the bias is along the angle of the trailing edge, or what direction did you choose?
Sure. So this is where that kind of panel layout comes into play, right? So in the middle, right, this black fabric is all going parallel to the leading edge, right? Because you do have that kind of stress going side to side along the leading edge. Same with down here. This red going from the corner, you can actually see the stress lines here, right? So the grain of the fabric is going with that stress line to make sure that that's strong. But then over here, I feel like the stress, if anywhere, there's not really a whole lot of stress in here, but if there were, it seems like it's mostly between the wingtip down to, like, between the wingtips, right, along the trailing edge. So I have the bias going diagonally here to go with the trailing edge. Same with this red panel going with the trailing edge. And then everywhere else, the bias is vertical and horizontal to kind of go with the leading edge stress and the vertical spar stress. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Yeah. You chuck that guy over there. Okay. Cool. So let's see, we'll jump over to the next one. This is this was my 60th kite. So I wanted to do something a little bit different. Oh, actually, I see Alvin Braff had a quick question about sail curvatures of the leading edge. I haven't played with that a little bit. Well, I have played with that a little bit, just kind of in passing, but I didn't play with it too much specifically with this sail. I feel like you can get that. So what I did find was when I played with, let me think about how I can phrase what I'm thinking. So when I was making outdoor quadline kites earlier on, I was having issues with, I would build one side of the sail and then the other side of the sail and then put them together, right? And I was noticing after I built the sail, sometimes the center V was just like floppy. It was like really loose all the time. But my quadline kites weren't like my indoor quadline kites weren't like that. And I was like, what's going on? And so what I've realized is that the flex built into the leading edge, right? You usually build a curve into the leading edge sail. What that ends up doing is that's what tensions the center V, right? So when because the spar in the leading edge wants to be straight. So if you're forcing it into a curve, it's going to be flexing outward all the time. So it's kind of pulling these leading edge rods outward, and it makes that center V a lot more taut, right, by having more bend in the leading edge. So that's kind of where I think what the noticeable difference was. And so what I noticed with my outdoor kites was that when I was piecing the two halves together, instead of piecing them together like evenly, I was kind of piecing them together like just offset slightly. And so it wasn't, the bend wasn't allowing for the leading edge to flex back out and push those vertical rods outward to tighten up that middle. So yeah, so for Albin, I didn't experiment with sail curvature too much specifically, but I did at least have some experiences that kind of explained to me what how that works and what the effect is of it. Does that answer your question? Okay, cool. Thanks, Albin. Okay, so jump into the next bit. Yeah, so for my 60th kite, I wanted to build something a little bit different. So I made this kite. It's called Deal With It. So those of you that are maybe internet savvy will recognize this as the sort of pixelated sunglasses that are frequently used in memes online. And I was thinking that like, oh, you know, this shape of the sunglasses is really close to like a Hedzeki wing quadline kite, right? It's got the skinny bit in the middle. It's got these, you know, two bigger wings. So like this could totally work, but it's a bit weird. So I thought about how to build this, and it was just, to be totally honest, I did not like put a lot of effort into like the quality of the build it, because it was just like, this is just a joke. So I'm just like kind of made it work. So if I were to build it again, I'd probably do the build process slightly differently. But it was certainly interesting to think about. So, oh no, I got the order wrong. No, that's fine. So like one of the things thinking about was like, okay, it's got all these little jagged bits down in here, right? So how do I keep this all sticking out right? So what I've ended up with is a frame where there's 3 vertical rods on each side, right? To kind of go for the main points. I got a main point out here, and out here. So I need those to be explicitly supported by rods, because otherwise there's no other way for me to hold them out. But then those other ones could be supported with just a bit of line. So I sewed some grosgrain ribbon just to make a little loop. And then I have some line running that's attached to each end cap, and it just runs between the end caps through these hoops to keep those corners stuck out. And so that was a nice way of, so you can actually kind of see a little bit in this photo. It's kind of a little hard to see, but you can see the line coming straight up from the leading edge down to this end cap, then across here to hold these guys out. And then I've got another one going from here around the center to the next one that keeps all of these points pointing outward rather than flopping in the wind. So that was kind of interesting. Yeah, so the kite ended up being, as a result of this framing, the kite's really heavy because it just has a lot of, so the size of this kite is, the leading edge is a normal like Hedzeki wing, like Rev 1.5 sized leading edge. So it's the normal width of like a typical kite, but with the design, it's a bit more narrow. So it has a bit less sail to be able to capture the wind. Plus it has all these extra vertical rods. So it's like really heavy for what it is. But you know, if the wind is good for it, then it actually does fly pretty well. The other thing I thought about in this regard was bridling, which was a little bit interesting. So the way that I approached this was, okay, I just went with like a normal, like the bridle from a Rev 1.5, for example. I just went with that because it's still a normal like 1.5 size leading edge. And then what I had to do was manipulate the bottom, which I have this picture kind of upside down. Maybe I should have fixed that. But on the bottom tips, right, normally you just have one end cap and the bridle just goes down to the one end cap. But I wanted both of these to be supported in flight. I didn't want them like flopping around for some reason. So instead of having the one line that comes down, I split it out into 2 and then also shortened the length between the top and bottom anchors. to compensate for the shorter sail. And after some tweaking, you know, it took a lot of tweaking to get it to feel about right, but ended up getting there in the end. So just this idea of, okay, hey, I'm starting with a Rev 1.5 looking kite, and then manipulating from there to change this design, make it a little shorter and stuff like that to get the visual look that I was going for and able to make it work. Yeah, one thing that I might have done differently would be maybe the framing in that, let's see if I can get to it. So because of how these two rods are parallel, I find that this part of the trailing edge tends to kind of like be floopy, kind of like it doesn't stay taut. So if I were to do it differently, I'd probably consider moving these two connectors maybe like closer together and have it be more of like a V coming down from the leading edge rather than two parallel lines. The thought being that then, okay, I have pressure going outward to kind of force that trailing edge to stay taut as opposed to it being able to cup and be all floopy. So I'd probably try that if I were to do it again, but generally this kite flies okay. I've flown it in team, which is a lot of fun. I think this is like my go-to mega fly kite now, because it's just great to see these like stupid sunglasses up in the sky with like a bunch of other quadline kites. It's great. But yeah, so that project was a lot of fun. See here, looks like a bowline similar to trick kite. Yeah, kind of like a bowline. Yeah, for those anyone unfamiliar with a bowline, that's the line that goes from the wingtips and then up to the spine to kind of keep the line from snagging and stuff like that. Keep the line from snagging on the tail of a dual line kite. So yeah, it's very, very similar. Just the concept here is to hold out these little floppy bits to give some tensioning to them. So it's almost in another way, it's almost like a leech line, but where like it just kind of goes through little points of the sail. See, Daryl has a question. How well does the line work to keep the points out? I'm looking at doing something similar on a single line while I'm designing. You know, I've been very pleased with it. I mean, you can see here, like this is it set up when I was flying it, and it's staying out there pretty well. Yeah, and I've been quite happy with that. I think the main idea is just to identify like where the primary like outcropping points are, right? And that like I couldn't get away with anything. Like I need a rod to support this point because it's like ultimately and a protruding point. But these other ones, like if you can make it work, I've been very happy with that as opposed to running like a ton of spars, right? Yeah, and then Mickey had a question. Would using reinforcing mesh in the negative space detract from the look too much? Yeah, I don't, I mean, maybe. I really wanted to like have the sunglasses. And so I felt if it was like a Hadziki wing kite that just has the sunglasses on it, it just like wouldn't be quite the same. So yeah, so you could do it that way. It just wasn't, I don't know, I wanted something different. I'd made 59 Hadziki wing kites by this point. So I didn't really want to do another one. I wanted to do something a little bit different. Let's see here. Catherine mentions, looks like it's pulling quite a bit. You know, it's not too bad. It really doesn't, it's so heavy that it really doesn't pull too much unless the wind is up real high. Alban asked if there's any video of the kite in flight. There's a little bit when I first made it. I made it just a really stupid jokey video where I flew it on a dog stake and then brought it down above my face and then faded to gray and played thug music. But other than that, I don't think there's actually any video out there at the moment. Because I kind of wanted to just like stick to the joke. But it's probably been long enough now that I should probably get some video of it flying. But yeah, okay, cool. And Gordon, nice to hear that you're still liking your breathe. You know, any other questions before I jump on? I think the next bit will be jumping into some dual line stuff. Any thoughts? Okay, cool. So dual line stuff. So I've only started building dual line kites in the last year. Built the first one like during the whole COVID thing. So I don't have as much experience in these to have, you know, done as many experiments. But I have a few things that stood out to me. And kind of bearing in mind that at this point, I'd built a ton of quadline kites. So transitioning from quadline over to dual line was interesting to me because quadlines are so easy. They're flat. They're flat. What you see on the table is what you see in the sky. It's so simple because it's flat. But a dual line kite is not, right? It's very three-dimensional. And so it makes it hard to know, okay, if I design the sail, what do the curves do to it? What does it end up looking like after I design a sail? Or, you know, there's so many of these different variables about the depth of the sail and the width of the sail and the, you know, the weighting and just all these kinds of things. So it's very, very complicated. So I only have a few bits that I feel at all confident on. But so the first one is the spine. The spine was very interesting to me in that the initial thought might be to just have, okay, I have the two halves and they come together at a straight line and they seam together, right? That's like really obvious. The problem is that the spine is not a straight rod at the end of the day. It's under tension, so it is bowed, right? And so that's where you get, like on this guy, this is a 99 SUL, I think. You can see these stress lines going from the standoff to the center T, right? And that's because the spine is being flexed inward toward the sail. That flex is being directed to where that center T is because that's what's holding, that's where it's kind of being held out. And so you end up with this tension line. So to resolve that, what we can do is create your panel layout, your sail layout with just, so this is the layout for the kite I'm working on, called the Shiznit, is my indoor kite that I'm designing. But so instead of it being a straight line on either side, there's actually a Bezier curve going outward. So it's a curve going from the top to the bottom with its apex being at the center T. And so then when I put the kite together, I deal with it as if it's a straight line. I put these two together and just have the 1/4 inch seam between these two outcropped curves. And what that does is that creates a cup, a bit of a cup, right? That has an apex right at the center T. And that makes it so we get rid of those stress lines and you have a nice flat sort of internal layer there, as opposed to having those stress lines between the standoffs and the center T. And so that's very nice. So it takes a bit of effort to maybe experiment with how much of a curve is necessary. It depends on how tensioned your spine is or that sort of thing. I've seen some kites with much longer, much more extreme curves and some with less. But yeah, my goal there was just to eliminate those little stress lines in the sail. Yeah. The next topic that I have on dual line is the kite house nose. Some people might have heard of this. So the nose on a dual line kite, right? There's a very common problem where, you know, you crash all the time, and your spine ends up wearing through the nose and it pops out, right? You see this a lot where, you know, a lot of older kites will have that just a folded piece, you know, maybe some multiple layers of reinforcement, just a folded piece with a pocket that goes up and the spine goes all the way right up to the end. So what I really like about the kite house nose is what happens is that we actually have seaming going along the leading edge, stopping it here, and then also along here. So the spine only comes up to this point. It doesn't, like, this whole section is empty. It's just fabric. And the spine only comes up to here. And so the really interesting thing about this is that, okay, now we're separating the spine pocket from the point of wear. Because why does the spine poke through the nose? Because we're hitting it on the ground all the time. So if the spine is no longer at the same point that we're running into the ground all the time, then, okay, this whole square can wear down all day. We can ram that into the ground so much before it impacts the spine, because it's got to wear through like 1.5 centimeters of fabric before it even gets to the spine pocket, right? So I really like that approach in terms of durability. You can even go a little bit shorter and just cut, like, you know, do a line down here or something like that. I've done that for doing repairs. Like I repaired an old Chimera that had a hole in the nose. And so I repaired it with a modification on the kite house nose where it was like this, but I didn't want to cut down the rod. So I didn't want to like take a whole centimeter chunk out of the leading edge, out of the spine pocket. So I just put a little bit of a seam, maybe a quarter of an inch from the tip of the nose, just to give a little bit of fabric reinforcement between the point of impact in the ground and the spine. So even retrofitting older kites can work with that approach to kind of add that bit of reinforcement. There's also some theory about this in terms of like, with this setup, it does make this kind of pleasing like cup shape. It looks really nice. But there's some theory around, you know, that kind of benefiting in flight. I could see it maybe, I don't know. I haven't really tested it, but I've seen that suggested. I don't really know what I think of that. I'm not entirely convinced. I like the durability argument. I think that one's pretty solid. But yeah, so really happy with the kite house nose. I'm doing that on pretty much all of my dual line kites now because it looks really nice and it's got those big durability benefits. Yeah. Any questions about that stuff before we jump into, I've got another kite that I've designed, a dual line kite that I'm working on designing as well. Talk through that stuff, but any questions on this bit? Why do you use this material for the nose? Is it soft? You know, I don't know. I went through, what was it? It was a On the Line podcast. So I started building dual line kites when they had a dual line session to like dual line build along. And what they had mentioned in their tutorial was this particular fabric. I forget what it was called. I'll have to look it up. Started with a D, I think. But so I ended up with two different weights of it. And it's you know, like traditionally a lot of people have used like that seatbelt stuff for the noses, which is just like so thick and hard to use. And I feel like it's also kind of stretchy and kind of prone to spines poking out. But so this is the stuff that I'm using now. And it's pretty strong. It has like, it's like double layered. I got it from Seattle Fabrics. I forget what it was called. Yeah, I'm not sure how well I can increase the size of my cursor. Is there any setting around here for, yeah, I'm not sure. Oh, I agree with your point about the cursor, but I'm not sure I have a way to do that. But anyway, yeah, so this stuff has been really nice. It's really easy to sew through. I could imagine that it's not quite as durable as the seatbelt stuff, but I end up doing a layer of this. I have a lighter one and a heavier one. I do a layer of this and then a layer of Dacron underneath that as well. And so far that seems pretty good paired with the kite house nose where you don't have this spine poking through the nose issue as much. So maybe I can get away with a bit of a lighter material on the nose. But yeah, I've been really happy with it so far. I can follow up later and look up the name of that material, but yeah. See, any other questions? Looks like that's it. Okay, cool. So next, I kind of chat a little bit about the Shiznit. So the Shiznit is a dual line kite that I've been working on designing. This is an indoor dual line kite. So I've flown a number of indoor dual line kites and never really felt 100% on board with any of them. Some of the ones that I really liked were Lamb's VIP2, that I have one of those, and that's been my primary kite for a while. The Focus Kites Reflection, and the Wolfgang Siebert Itrix. So I really liked the Itrix. It was a little bit small and a little bit heavy, but I felt like it was the closest to what I want. And I tried for a while to get one, but Wolfgang stopped making years ago, so it's like impossible to get one. So I ended up meeting up with Toby Arndt. He has one that he's been flying for years, and so I threw it up on the wall and traced it out to get the dimensions, and I built one just to see if I could build one. But then I was thinking about, okay, I want to go further. I want to have the sort of ideal indoor kite for me. So what I thought about with the Itrix is, like I mentioned, it's a little bit too small, a little bit too heavy and stiff. The Lamb's VIP2 was also a little bit too small for me and maybe a little too squishy. The reflection was a little too big. So that kind of like set up my parameters for size, right? I want something a little bit bigger than the Atrix, but not quite as big as the Reflection. I'm hoping that I didn't end up as big as the Reflection. I don't actually have a Reflection to compare to, but I don't think it's as big as the Reflection by memory, but I could be wrong. Maybe I've just made another Reflection. Yeah, so first thing was the size. So I started with the Atrix and then just kind of scaled it up a little bit. I ended up scaling it up just enough so that the leading edge is one piece at 45 inches. I did 45 inches because when I order rods, I can get them ordered at 45 inches and then I don't have to cut them. And at 45 inches, it fits in my hard case that I have back there, which I travel with. So that hard case is like, everything needs to be able to fit in there at bare minimum. So I won't go longer than what can fit in the hard case. And 45 inches fits the bill. So that's where I'm at the moment. And I use the same frame as the Atrix, which is a 4mm pultruded carbon. My thought was that, okay, this is heavy and a little stiff on the Atrix, but if I make the sail a bit bigger, then now you're bending that heavier, stiffer rod over a longer distance. And so it'll feel a little bit softer and a little bit lighter as a result because you have more sail area. So my hope was that it would go in that direction. From what I have so far, it feels okay. I might go and swap out and try a 3mm pultruded carbon in a few bits. But so that's kind of the general direction I've been heading in size and framing. And then I've been thinking a lot about sort of okay, how do I think about how long do I make these rods? Right? Like most of the time when I've built kites, it's from an open source plan and there's like, oh, you cut your rods this length. But now I need to figure out myself. But some of the rods are easy, right? The leading edge, you just cut to the sail. You stick it in there, see how much sticks out and cut off the rest. But the spine, same deal. The spine is kind of a fixed length. But the lower spreaders and the upper spreader are a little harder to figure out and a little more variable because you could have a different length of lower spreader for the same sail. And all it does is it makes the kite either wider or shorter and less deep or more deep. So I'm thinking a lot about, well, what does that do? If I make the lower spreader wider and shallow and make the sail shallower, how does that feel compared to a more narrow and deeper sail? So I've been experimenting with that a bit. My theory at the moment is that I've been having a little bit of trouble getting it into things like slot machines or like 540s, these like flare out and then flat spins. Could be maybe a weight issue, but I have a feeling that maybe the depth of the sail is getting in the way a little bit. So if I maybe go a bit more shallower, maybe it'll help with that sort of thing and make it a bit more floaty. I'm not really sure. But so that's been an interesting thing to kind of think about and test. Another part I've been thinking a lot about is the bridle. Bridles are so complicated. But so I started with like a simple 3-point bridle like this, right? I started with basically, I just tied 3 lengths of line all at the same length, threw it together into a 3-point bridle and then adjust it later. And there's a few points to notice. One, the first one that I feel very confident on is the horizontal positioning of the toe points, right? You have 2 toe points, you could have them really close together at the spine, or you could have them really far apart over by the leading edge, right? So what's the right point? And I think a nice guide for me was the fade. When you put a kite into the fade, right, you're sitting it with, I'm gonna go get a good dual line kite, hold on. Okay, so when you're sitting in a fade, right, you're gonna sit in this orientation. Yeah, right, with the lines coming out over the leading edge. So how far apart your toe points are determines the pitch of your fade, right? So if the toe points are really close towards the nose, then you're not going to be able to rise in that fade because the nose is being pulled down by those lines. And if your line is too far out to the side, you're going to have a really extreme pitch, and it might be just too much to be able to get lift. So finding that right point where you can get a nice slowly rising fade based on the horizontal positioning of the toe points kind of leads you into, okay, here's the right spot for that. So that was kind of interesting to think about. I think another thing that leads into is your ability to turn. I think from what I've seen so far, and I'm not sure if this is related to the depth of the bridle as well, but if the toe points are really close together, it's hard to have a tight turn because when you have just less leverage on one side versus the other. So you end up with this kind of like slow, unpressured turn if they're too close together. So when I was trying to get the kite to turn better, then pushing it out towards the sides helped with that a lot as well. So that was kind of interesting. The depth portion, I've been thinking a lot about, like how deep of the, like how far does the sail, or does the bridle sit off from the sail? Has been an interesting bit. I need to experiment more with that. I thought I had an idea about the turning, but I think that's actually more attributed to the horizontal positioning of the toe points. Another thing that I've been thinking about was with my first prototype, I was having issues going from flying into a pancake and then popping into a fade. And what I was noticing, it could be adjusted in the bridle, but I was noticing that with a static bridle, there's not much forgiveness, right? Because when you pop in, you need to be pulling just until all the lines in the bridle get taut, and then you need to release. And if you don't time that right, then you mess it up. So moving to a dynamic bridle has been kind of interesting. So this is a picture of a dynamic bridle. So the interesting thing here is that you can have all lines be taut and have the toe point still be in a few positions. It has some range. So when popping from a pancake into a fade, you have a little bit of give, a little bit of tolerance when the lines go all taut, because it can still be taut for a little while it's rotating. So that kind of, I feel like, made the popping into a fade a little bit easier. And then the last thing that I was talk about here was, again, I was struggling with like, what do I make this kite look like? I feel like I was extra struggling because I don't know if I design something on a flat surface, what it translates to when it's curved, like when it's set up. So I decided, okay, like throw away my thoughts about visual design, because I'm not a visual designer anyway, so those aren't very valuable. And think back to what I did with the Breeze, thinking about, fabric bias, right? And how I want to optimize for that. And so when I thought about that, this is the panel layout that I ended up with. So I thought about, okay, what are the points of stress? One of the major points that I identified that I feel like a lot of dueling kites were missing was from between the center T to the standoff is a big pressure point. You can see it a lot of times, right? If you don't have the curve in your spine, you can see that pressure, as we did on that 99 SUL. So making sure that the bias goes along with that was really important to me. So I have a panel going right from the center T down to the standoff so that I can have the bias be exactly the way that I want it to be. And then the second one being right along the spine, right? You definitely have stress that way. So having the bias run along the spine is useful. And then along the leading edge, you have a different bias because the leading edge is being bent and pressurized. So you have a lot of pressure along the leading edge and maybe a little bit along the trailing edge here. And that dictated the panel layout that I ended up with. So I felt like that methodology was really helpful because I was struggling with like coming up with what's the graphic and stuff like that. So so having this methodology to fall back on really helped a lot to help me get to a final design. And I'm quite happy with it. And one of the things that I'm actually really happy with is the fact that this whole design is all straight lines, but the little red spiky bit sure looks like a curve. And that's purely out of the fact that the sail is three-dimensional and it curves down in there. That's a straight line. And it just curves in. And I think that's so cool because it was like, I did not really expect that. And then it was like, oh, there's this cool, like kind of curvy, pointy bit. And I was really, really pleased with that. So I found that to be really interesting. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much all that I have. Let me go through these real quick. Yeah, so that's me. That's my website, wadi.us. I post all my builds and things there. Yeah, we have about, 4 minutes left. If anyone has some questions, and then I'll have to try to hop over to the other session and get that started. I might actually open that up and so people can start joining there now. But yeah, any questions before we conclude? And Amy, you like the colors? Thank you. I don't like the colors. Those were just
I knew you. Yeah, I knew you. I knew you wouldn't like the colors, but I think they're great.
Yeah.
Question for you: have you ever been in contact at all with Jeff Howard about the Wren?
I have not.
Okay, it's a thought, because he doesn't want to build them anymore, and there's so many people that love them. But yeah, I mean, I know it's different than what you're doing, but I was just wondering.
Yeah, I mean, when I get more comfortable with building dual line kites, then something like that, like bringing back to life a kite that isn't made anymore, could be a fun project, and I'd be open to that in the future. But for now, yeah, I'm kind of trying to design what I have, but I think it'd be really
yeah. And let me just say again that with permission, I don't want anybody to think that we would ever do that, but
yeah, totally, yeah.
His kites are, the indoor Wren is one that's well sought after, and for good reason, for people like me who fly a lighter indoor. I don't do well on the Ictrix, or the other ones are too heavy for me. But yeah, so that's the thought.
Yeah, Gordon, I feel much more likely that I would help out building Wrens than I would a Thor's hammer.
Yeah.
Gordon, I've been asked about building a really big one, but God, what a pain in the ass that would be.
As far as material, I'm guessing you're using mostly Ictrix, but
yes.
Have you tried ripstop? Is there places where ripstop, with its greater flexibility, stretchability, would be beneficial, or what's your thought there on Ictrix versus ripstop?
I use some ripstop tape for really light leading edges. I do use that, but generally for sport kites, I really don't want flex in the sail. So Ictrix is really fantastic for that use. The alternative might be when you jump into like power kites, like foils and things, right? They have this whole characteristic that they fill up with air and then they pressurize, and that can happen really quickly, and that can put a lot of stress on seams. So having a more flexible ripstop for that use case is really useful when it comes into paragliders or power kites and that sort of thing, because you need a little bit of give, otherwise you're going to tear your sail when the kite loads up. But for sport kites, yeah, having it really taut and tight and inflexible is actually nice. Cool. Okay. Well, we only have about 1 minute left. I'm going to jump over to the next session with John Trenopole to make sure that people aren't going crazy there. I'm just there admitting people at the moment, but I'm not actually listening. So they could be going crazy and I wouldn't know. So thanks for coming along.